As history teachers, we are used to visiting museums with our students, but how can we teach in a more inclusive way if our museums are the representation of the colonial past of Europe? We asked Iolanda Pensa for a lecture about the decolonization in museums.
I wanted to start this presentation about decolonizing museum by talking about the definition of museum. In 2022, ICOM, the International Commission of Museum, have presented the new definition of museum. And this is really a game changer in the field of cultural institution. It's not simply that the social responsibility and the social role of museums become more and more important, but it's also that the role of museum changes in relationship to its collection. The museum is no longer the owner of the collection, but is rather the custodian of collection. So the museum really needs to have an active role in redefining which ones are their collection, who is its public, who is the owner of its collection. And very often the owner of its collection are different communities. In this presentation, I wanted to highlight three aspects that I think have strongly influenced what we now call the decolonization of museum. The first issue is related to restitution. The second issue is related to provenance research. And the third issue is related to indigenous rights. So I will start with restitution. What happened in 2017 is that Emmanuel Macron, during a trip in Burkina Faso, he mentioned restitution to Africa. This has been really an incredible revolution within the world. It was the first time that a president in an official discourse talked about restituting artworks to colonies, to former colonies. And in 2018, a document, a report about those perspectives of restitution came out, le rapport sur la restitution du patrimoine culturel africain. This document has been really important to highlight how human remains should be restituted to original countries, and of course all objects of the collection that have been acquired in a context of conflicts, in a problematic context. One of the outcomes of this document and of this discourse about restitution is that the entire world is now talking about this issue. Many governments are now looking at their collection, the collection of their museums, and considering what is owned by those collections, what is inside those collections. This is an interesting map of the African collections in France that you can maybe look at to explore some of the outcome of this discussion. And also a very important international project that have been developed is Digital Benin, a project about the Kingdom of Benin, which is an important part of history in Africa that is now in Nigeria, during which in one of the battle with the British government, many objects of the Kingdom of Benin have been removed from Benin. And it was an incredible violent event. And now all the museums and collections that own objects coming from the Kingdom of Benin are putting together an archive to document which objects are located where, and how to rebuild this connection, and with the aim of bringing back those objects to their original country. The second issue that I wanted to highlight is provenance studies. So whenever you talk about restitution, but whenever you talk about how objects have arrived to a museum, the way to study this process and to recognize the ownership history of those objects is to do provenance studies. And now this is a working direction that is very important all over the world. Many museums are implementing provenance research, so they are looking at each object of their collection, each object in their deposits, and highlighting where do they come from, doing archive research with also specialized researchers. Furthermore, many governments are requesting museums to do provenance research. And when we talk about provenance research, we talk in general about where those objects come from, what is their history. This is an example of the museum in Bern, in which you find in obviously the object of art, the painting, but also a caption that tells you who is the author, the date of the painting, but also tells you about the provenance history of this object. So many museums are now starting associating to their object also the history of that provenance. And furthermore, they're studying their collection. This is another example from the Museum of Bern. They did a very deep research on Grutlit, who was a collector that was connected to the Nazi history. So researching the artwork that have been donated to the Bern Museum, understanding the history of each work, understanding the provenance, how the objects were acquired and how it should be restituted or can be kept by the museum is really an effort that museums are doing also to acknowledge fascist and Nazi acquisition, so all the link between the institution and problematic history, and also the actual rights that are involved in those objects. In some cases, the situation is very clear. In other cases, it's very difficult to identify. There are cases in which the research produces a result that lets the institution think that it's ambiguous, but it can be kept the object. In others, further research is needed, and it is needed to look for the proper owner. Some of those cases have been managed, for example, with agreement with families that owned the object. Sometimes there is a payment to the family. Other times there is also an agreement with the family that they accept the object stays in the museum, but with a new caption and recognizing the property and the donation and the collaboration with the family. And the provenance research is, of course, very important to clarify the history of object, and it can be associated, of course, to history of Nazism, the Holocaust, fascism, but also colonial history and history related to indigenous community. So it's the first step to really identify to whom object belong to, what is the history of those objects, what is the legitimacy of keeping that object in the museum, or how it needs to be dealt and question the way the object arrived to the museum. The last topic I wanted to address, excuse me, this is also, you can find further information about provenance research on this website. There is a full repository with many links to the different research that have been implemented in many, many countries around the world. The last issue I wanted to address related to Decolonizing Museum is the importance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So in 2007, the United Nations, with this declaration, have really highlighted the importance of considering the rights of Indigenous people. And the role of Indigenous people has been very important. First of all, to look at the identification of objects in the museum, but also to how to rewrite the history of those museums, the history of the country where indigenous population were present. But when we talk about rights of indigenous people, we actually talk about rights of communities. So in the battle that the indigenous people have been doing around the world, and in particular in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, is actually very relevant also to take into consideration of the rights of all communities. In particular in the digital world, so not only in the object of museums, but also in the digital reproduction of those objects, in content that is now digital and obviously is very important for everyone in the world. What the research on indigenous rights have been producing is also a very new attention to how data and knowledge should be managed. So at the moment, when we talk about open access, open data, open science, open government data, we talk about opening knowledge and making knowledge available to anyone, also for reuse. And there are some principles called the FAIR principle for data. There are those FAIR data, so findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. Those are principles to produce data and knowledge that can be easily findable for anyone, be fully accessible so people can really find it and browse it on the internet. Interoperable means that data that are produced can also work with other data, and reusable means that is at the disposal of others to produce new products, new services to be used in education everywhere. So those are principles for the quality of data. But indigenous research has produced an attention to care principles, so other principles that need to be taken into consider when we talk about knowledge. Collective benefit, authority to control, so the possibility of participating in decisions that relate to this knowledge, responsibility, and ethics. And in this way, we go back to the definition of museums, in which, for the first time, an emphasis on professionality and responsibility, the social role, and ethics has been really highlighted in the new definition. So also museum, when they take care of their object, but also of their digital data, they need to take into consideration not only their role as custodian, but the participation, the belonging of those objects to many other people, and also issues of ownership in the broader sense. An interesting project related to the care principle are those labels that have been created by local context that allow institutions and communities to address those issues and to claim rights on digital content. So you find on the website of local context a series of tools that even people can use to show that there are sensitive materials that communities should be contacted, or furthermore allowing communities and institutions to express specific restriction and attention notice to content. Think about, for example, secret objects. So objects that are owned by museums, that are in the collection of the museum, but they were not meant to be shown to the public, that have been used in rituals, and they were not designed to be publicly seen. For example, those objects are considered sensitive by many communities, and they don't want those objects to be shown, not even in their digital format. So in this case, it is a way to associate a notice to this content, even if it's in public domain, even if this content could be freely accessible. It is important to take into consideration the voice of the communities and also the value of that object and the story of that object and the role that it plays within a community. The same thing for human remains, which is of course a very sensitive topic. Now there are a lot of attention in the restitution of human remains to the community belonging, the possibility of burying relatives, ancestors, but also the images of human remains are a sensitive topic, as well as photos that represent people in situations that can be dramatic, and people have the right also to express how they want their history and their image to be communicated. I wanted to conclude this short presentation about Decolonizing Museum on some broader issue, because when we talk about Decolonizing Museum, we're actually talking about decolonizing knowledge. We're talking about a broad topic, something that is tells us about how we need to be careful in the way we communicate history, which is a role that many cultural institutions play. The first and major issue is, of course, power dynamics. When you talk about decolonizing museum, we are talking about the role of certain nation and the power of certain nation that was stronger and has a different history than the role of other nations and minorities. So the first issue that needs to be considered, and it needs to be considered in the way museums are built, collection have been created, but also in the way we tell history. So how we really need to renegotiate and take into consideration how that history was designed and created at first. A second issue is obviously the role of the power role compared to minority. So making sure that all voices are acknowledged. I like very much this work of Mamun, an Egyptian artist that had created this photo that have been circulated in the city of Cairo, remembering how really power dynamic shapes our cities and our way of perceiving the world. Another attention that we need to consider is responsibility. This is a work of Munir Fatmi, an artist from Morocco, that presented this work at the Dakar Biennale. And once again, we know about the history of European nations, the world's nation, and how their role, their central role also needs to be re-questioned and also face the responsibility that we have in history. And this is also another element we need to consider when we visit museum, when we think about the history we know and how we want to redesign it. Obviously, also how minority have been and how people have been excluded or included within our history. There is a lot of discussion about how only male artists and protagonists have a great visibility in exhibition and in history books. At the same time, small communities that don't really have a voice within our history book, once again, that are not properly documented. So considering the history excluded and also the history of people that are have not been properly documented yet is another important element to consider. This is a graphic work of Czeslaw Iwanchenko, two artists from Belarus. Finally, there is also the issue on how we portray people, what kind of image of them we presented in our books, in our collections, in our exhibitions. What kind of image are we projected on people? Are we allowing communities to represent themselves, to say something about themselves? Also, this is a major issue that many artists have presented. This is a work of Samuel Fosso, also questioning the African identity and how we represent the other and how we want to represent ourselves. Many artists, once again, a work of Munir Fatmi talking about the Black Panther. Many artists have been also contributing to rewriting history and reconsidering how certain history have been strongly documented and others still need to be re-questioned and reorganized. I wanted to also showing you this work of Tracy Rose, an artist from South Africa that did an intervention in Douala. This is a primary school in which she created those paintings of animals and flowers, but also a series of writing on another word. And in theory, this is it wanted to be a decoration for the school, but it's actually kind of carnivore plants and animals that are not completely innocent. They're quite scary if we look at them. And also the words that she put on walls. Um, it's a list of words that have been used in anthropology books to define people. And this is another key element of how museum work. Categories, the way they organize knowledge, the way they structure also and really create groups, associate people to ethnical groups, organizing the entire system of knowledge. It is something that had an incredible impact on knowledge. And a lot of artists question this. And in the process of decolonizing knowledge, categories is one of the most important elements to be analyzed and deconstruct, and to be reorganized, and also create new association and create something new. Personally, I think also this discourse about decolonizing museums and decolonizing knowledge also related to center and periphery. When we think about little museums in the mountains, ethnographical museums, I think all of them can benefit from this approach of considering power dynamic, consider how we decided to create knowledge and how we decided to talk about it. I think considering communities, not only of these indigenous communities that now have claimed their right and started defining themselves and creating a role for themselves, but also considering all kind of communities, and also isolated one that never got the centrality, I think is very important. And a lot of research on history is now moving from a perspective of a protagonist, so highlighting maybe one person in the history, towards focusing more on community dynamics, that they can also present a different way of portraying reality and showing phenomena that are not necessarily associated to one person, which if we look at school books, often it was a male, a white male, and very rarely it contemplated protagonists that were more different. So looking at communities can be really a relevant direction everywhere in the world and in every institution and museum. To conclude, the role of museums is really a role of reinterpreting history, looking at how the past is presented, and think about how we can look at the present and the future. I like this work of Saliful Indu that just put it in front of Warrior River in Douala, to allow to see a little spot of Douala in a very poor neighborhood where fishermen, they normally wash themselves after work. And he created something beautiful and something unexpected in just a little corner. And I think this is somehow the role of museums today. So creating new perspective, allowing to see things that we didn't see, and really have a critical role. Of course, the analysis of themselves, looking at their history, looking at their collection, is the first step to move forwards. But I think the role, and it is defined in the definition, the new definition of museum of 2022, is really to help us as a society to be critical and capable of looking at the past, but also the present and the future. When we talk about decolonizing museum, we're talking about decolonizing knowledge, and power dynamics are always a center of attention. We need to consider how museum present themselves, how we present history. And this is a work of Yinka Shonibare that very nicely explain and shows those power dynamics. His work is always having those character dressed up with those what we call or what we think is a typical African fabric, but it actually is not. Or maybe it shows what the complexity of what we call Africa it is. In fact, this kind of fabric comes from Indonesia and the Netherlands, but is very commonly associated to African style. And these different origins of those objects that they talk about colonial history, but they talk also about a history of a nation and continent that is complex, rich, and extremely connected, very well portrays a history that very often we don't manage with the proper complexity. In fact, also this scene that shows a sort of Victorian environment, so those figures looks like discussing about the future of the world. They could be maybe in Great Britain within aristocratic gathering. Obviously, they are completely played around, and they present a sort of détournement with those fabrics and without head, like not knowing where they're going and the destiny of the world. How could it be redesigned? The work of Yinka Shonibare is actually very consistent, and it always creates those very strange scenes that are disturbing, that we think we are familiar with, that we associate to one continent, but in reality they're talking about a complexity of the world. And I think acknowledging complexity, considering more than one owner, and considering the richness of the object of museum, but also the richness of stories when we talk about history and knowledge, it is the best way we can do to redesign museum and recreate a better history for everyone.